You believe more money will solve your problems. You scroll through accounts of lottery winners, tech billionaires, overnight crypto millionaires, and you think to yourself, if only. If only you had that kind of wealth, you could finally breathe. You could pay off the debts, quit the job that drains you, buy the house, the car, the freedom. You imagine wealth as liberation, as the end of anxiety, the beginning of the good life. But you are catastrophically wrong. History has already run this experiment, and the results were so devastating, so complete in their destruction, that they should terrify every person who dreams of unearned riches. This is not a story about Spain getting lucky. This is a story about Spain getting poisoned. In 1545, they struck the largest vein of silver the world had ever known. Within decades, they controlled more wealth than any empire in human history. They became gods walking the earth. And then they discovered that gold doesn't build nations. It rots them from the inside out. The year is 1556. King Philip II inherits the Spanish throne, and along with it, an empire that circles the globe. Spain controls vast territories across Europe, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, chunks of Germany. Across the Atlantic, Spanish conquistadors have carved out kingdoms larger than all of Western Europe combined. Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina. The empire quite literally never sees the sun set. Every hour of every day, somewhere under Spanish rule, the sun is shining on Spanish soil. Philip II sits in his palace at El Escorial and receives reports. Ships are arriving from the Americas. The manifest numbers are staggering. Tons of silver, mountains of it. The mines at Potosí alone are producing more precious metal than the rest of the world combined. At their peak, these mines will account for 60% of global silver output. Imagine that. A single mountain in Bolivia funding an entire empire. His father, Charles V, left him a debt of 36 million ducats. A debt so massive that the interest payments alone consume a quarter of annual revenue. But Philip is not worried. Because every month, silver fleets cross the Atlantic. Every month, the treasure flows. He has a printing press that produces money. What could possibly go wrong? The answer arrives slowly at first. In 1557, just 1 year into his reign, Philip defaults on his loans. Not because the money stopped coming. The silver is still flowing. The ships still arrive. But somehow, inexplicably, there isn't enough. The bankers, German families like the Fuggers, Italian families like the Genoese, they've lent him millions. And Philip, who has more gold and silver than any human being in history, cannot pay them back. So he simply declares a suspension of payments. A decreto. The crown will review all debts, all terms, all interest rates. And until that review is complete, nothing will be paid. The Fugger banking family is particularly exposed. They had financed Charles V's election as Holy Roman Emperor decades earlier. They own mines in Spain itself, mercury mines at Almaden. They've borrowed money from the Catholic Church and from financial centers like Antwerp to lend to the Spanish crown. When Philip defaults, the Fuggers are devastated. Their entire financial empire teeters, but they cannot force a king to pay. They cannot seize collateral from an empire. They can only wait, negotiate, and hope. It takes 9 years to negotiate a settlement. 9 years during which Spain's access to credit markets evaporates. 9 years during which military campaigns stall, soldiers go unpaid, and rivals gain ground. The Duke of Alba, commanding Spanish forces in the Netherlands, writes desperate letters. His men are deserting. They haven't been paid in months. Some are selling their weapons just to buy food. The unpaid soldiers begin looting Dutch cities to survive, which turns a religious dispute into a full-scale independence war. The lack of credit is costing Spain more than money. It's costing them their empire. When the settlement finally arrives in 1566, the lenders get about 60 cents on the dollar. They are furious, but they have no choice. You cannot foreclose on a king. You cannot repossess an empire. So they swallow the loss, and incredibly, they lend again. Because the silver keeps coming. Because surely this time will be different. The Genoese banking families, seeing an opportunity, step in to replace the Germans. They offer new loans, but at higher rates. Much higher rates. Interest climbs from 17% to 30%, then to 40%. By the 1570s, some loans carry rates of 48%. These are loan shark numbers. But Philip needs the money, and the bankers need the returns to justify the risk. Everyone knows this is unsustainable. Everyone pretends otherwise. It is not different. In 1575, Philip defaults again. This time the outstanding debt is 14.6 million ducats, roughly 2 years of total revenue. The Silver Mountain is still producing. The treasure fleets still cross the ocean. And yet Spain is broke. The decree comes in September. All payments suspended. All contracts under review. The bankers had seen it coming. Some, in fact, had stopped lending months before, forcing Philip's hand. When you create a crisis by refusing to lend, then negotiate favorable terms in the settlement, you can profit even from a bankruptcy. The Genoese understand this game well. How is this possible? How does an empire with unlimited money run out of money? The answer is uncomfortable. It is a truth that cuts against everything we believe about wealth. The problem isn't that Spain didn't have enough gold. The problem is that it had too much. Here is what happened. Every peso that arrived from America was, in effect, a counterfeit bill printed into existence. It increased the amount of currency floating around Spain without increasing the amount of goods and services available to buy. So prices rose, and they rose everywhere. Food became more expensive. Cloth became more expensive. Labor became more expensive. By 1560, prices in Spain had already doubled from where they stood at the century's start. This was before the really massive silver flows hit. By 1600, prices had tripled or quadrupled. Economist Earl Hamilton documented this meticulously. Prices in Spain rose approximately 250% between 1500 and 1600. That's not modern hyperinflation by any means. It averages out to about 1.5% per year. But in an economy where people expected prices to remain stable for generations, where contracts and wages were set with the assumption of price stability, this was catastrophic. Wages, however, did not keep pace. A farmer who sold his wheat could suddenly afford less bread. A craftsman who made cloth could buy fewer tools. Workers found that each year their labor purchased less than the year before. Real incomes collapsed, even as nominal incomes rose. The currency was destroying itself from the inside out, and nobody in power understood why. The Spanish crown collected the same amount of taxes in 1600 as they had in 1540. But that money was worth a fraction of what it once had been. They never adjusted tax rates for inflation. So the empire got richer in silver and poorer in real purchasing power simultaneously. But inflation was only the first symptom. The real disease was far more insidious. Spain's manufacturing sector began to collapse. Wool production in Salamanca fell by 60%, and the number of sheep, the foundation of Spain's medieval prosperity, plummeted. Textile manufacturing in Toledo fell by 75%. These were not small businesses. These were pillars of the Spanish economy, industries that had made Spain wealthy long before a single ounce of American silver arrived. In 1572, the port of Santander exported 17,000 sacks of wool on 66 ships. By 1622, just 50 years later, only 505 sacks departed on 11 ships. A 97% collapse in a single generation. Why did they collapse? Because Spanish goods became uncompetitive. When your currency is artificially strong from gold inflows, your products become expensive for foreigners to buy. A Spanish merchant selling cloth to France or England had to charge higher prices just to break even in the inflated domestic economy. Meanwhile, foreign goods became cheaper for Spaniards to import. Why invest in a domestic wool industry when you can buy cheaper English wool? Why build Spanish ships when you can buy better Dutch ships for less? Why manufacture anything when silver makes importing easier? The economists call this Dutch disease. The real exchange rate appreciates. Your exports become expensive. Your imports become cheap. Your manufacturing base withers. Your economy becomes dependent on the resource that caused the problem in the first place. Spain pioneered this pattern. They invented it. And they paid the price in full. And so Spain's productive economy hollowed out. The silver paid for imports. Massive imports. Spain became a nation of consumers, not producers. They bought textiles from the Netherlands, ships from Genoa, weapons from Germany, then food from across Europe. They paid for all of it with silver, and it felt like wealth. It felt like power. The Spanish aristocracy could afford luxuries from around the world. Chinese silk, Indian spices, Flemish tapestries, Italian art. Walk through a noble's house in 1580 and you would see treasures from 4 continents. But none of it was made in Spain. They were selling their future to pay for their present. When you can buy anything, you lose the ability to make anything. The skills atrophy. The craftsmen leave for other countries where their talents are valued. The workshops close. The apprenticeship systems break down. The know-how vanishes. A man whose father was a master weaver finds no one willing to teach his son the trade. Why bother learning a skill when that entire industry is dying? The social fabric tears. Such entire towns that had been centers of production for centuries became ghost towns. By the 1590s, entire Spanish cities had transformed into empty shells. The cities de-urbanized. People moved back to the countryside because there were no jobs in manufacturing anymore. Spain's urbanization rate, which had been rising through the early 1500s, reversed. Cities shrank. The commercial middle class, the merchants, craftsmen, traders who had been building Spain's prosperity, evaporated. What replaced them? A rentier aristocracy that lived off land rents and silver revenues. A parasitic class that produced nothing and consumed everything. Inequality spiked. The rich got vastly richer. The poor got devastated. And the productive middle ground disappeared entirely. These numbers are not abstractions. Behind every closed workshop is a family that once made a living. Behind every shuttered export business are children who no longer inherit their father's trade. You cannot eat silver. You cannot shelter your family with gold coins. Wealth is not metal. Wealth is the capacity to produce things people need. And Spain had traded that capacity for piles of glittering poison. Meanwhile, Philip's wars continued without pause. He spent 10 million ducats building the Spanish Armada to invade England in 1588. He assembled 130 ships and 30,000 men for the largest naval invasion in history. The plan was to sail up the English Channel, pick up an additional 30,000 soldiers waiting in the Spanish Netherlands, and invade Protestant England to restore Catholicism. The fleet was destroyed by English fireships and North Atlantic storms. Ships sank, and men drowned by the thousands. The survivors limped home in disgrace. So Philip spent another 10 million ducats to rebuild it. 2 years of total revenue spent on one military disaster and its reconstruction. He was fighting in the Netherlands, trying to crush a Protestant rebellion. That war alone would last 80 years and cost hundreds of millions of ducats. He was fighting the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, defending Italy, protecting trade routes from pirates and rivals, suppressing rebels in Aragon. Maintaining a global empire requires a global military, and Philip had to fund armies in the Netherlands, fleets in the Mediterranean, garrisons across Italy, and colonial administrators across 2 continents. All of it was paid for by borrowing against future silver shipments. The bankers, particularly the Genoese, developed a sophisticated system. They would lend Philip money in the form of short-term loans called asientos. These loans carried interest rates that climbed from 17% in the 1550s to 48% by the 1570s. Think about that. The king of the richest empire on earth was paying loan shark rates. Why? Because the bankers knew he was a bad credit risk. They knew he would default. They priced that risk into their loans. They front-loaded their profits, collected their fees immediately, and when Philip inevitably declared bankruptcy, they negotiated settlements that were still profitable over the long run. It was a cycle. Lend, default, renegotiate, lend again. Everyone was trapped in it. Philip needed the money to maintain the empire. The bankers needed the returns to justify the risk. Neither could escape. In 1596, Philip defaulted for the 4th time. By now, the pattern was obvious to anyone paying attention. Spain was not going through temporary cash flow problems. Spain was fundamentally broken. The empire that had conquered 2 continents could not manage its own finances. Despite controlling the single largest source of precious metals in human history, Spain was perpetually insolvent. This 4th bankruptcy rescheduled 7 million ducats, about 2/3 of yearly revenue. The settlement was actually gentler than previous ones. Lenders received about 81 cents on the dollar. But by this point, the damage to Spain's credibility was irreparable. Between 1500 and 1900, Spain would declare bankruptcy 13 times. 13. This is not a record of bad luck. This is a system failure. This is what happens when you confuse treasure for wealth. And here is the truly tragic part. The silver itself wasn't even staying in Spain. Most of it flowed straight through to foreign creditors, the German bankers, the Italian financiers, the Dutch merchants. They would lend Spain money. Spain would spend that money fighting wars and buying imports. And then the silver that arrived from America would be immediately shipped out again to repay debts with interest. Spain had become a middleman in its own exploitation. The empire existed to extract silver from the Americas and funnel it to European bankers. The Spanish people saw almost none of it. One study estimated that less than 1/3 of American gold and silver stayed in Spain. The rest was exported within months of arrival. Spain was a conduit, not a beneficiary. By 1600, Spain's per capita GDP was 40% higher than it would have been without the silver. This sounds good until you look at what happens next. By 1750, Spain's per capita GDP was 40% lower than it would have been without the silver. A complete reversal. The wealth had been an illusion, an 80-point swing from boom to bust across 150 years. The silver had destroyed the incentives to build real productive capacity. Why invest in infrastructure when you can buy foreign goods? Why develop new industries when silver pays for imports? Why educate your population when there's treasure to mine? Why build roads, ports, universities, legal institutions when you can just import what you need? Spain became addicted to extraction. And when the silver flows inevitably declined in the 17th century, as mines were exhausted, as labor shortages mounted, and as colonial administration became more expensive, Spain had nothing left. No industries, no financial system capable of mobilizing domestic capital, no institutional capacity to generate wealth through production and trade. They had spent 2 centuries consuming their future, and when the bill came due, they were bankrupt in every sense that mattered. Other European nations learned a different lesson. England and the Netherlands did not have silver mines. They had to create wealth the hard way, through trade, through manufacturing, through financial innovation. The Dutch invented government bonds, long-term, tradable debt instruments that allowed them to borrow cheaply to fund infrastructure and navy expansion. This gave them a massive advantage. They could mobilize capital for projects that took decades to pay off. The English invested in property rights, contract enforcement, and legal systems that encouraged entrepreneurship and protected investors. These seemed like small, boring advantages compared to Spain's mountain of silver. But in the long run, boring institutions beat treasure mountains. By 1700, both England and the Netherlands had surpassed Spain economically. By 1800, it wasn't even close. Spain had become a backwater, an agricultural economy dominated by aristocratic landowners, with almost no industrial base. The country that had once been the richest in Europe was now among the poorest. The reversal was total. Walk through this slowly because it is important. The silver created inflation, which made Spanish goods uncompetitive, which killed Spanish industries, which made Spain dependent on imports, which drained away the silver, which meant Spain had to borrow more, which meant higher interest payments, which meant less money for productive investment, which meant weaker industries, which meant more dependency on silver, which meant the cycle repeated until the entire structure collapsed. Each step made logical sense in isolation, but together they formed a death spiral. This is the resource curse. This is Dutch disease. This is what happens when unearned wealth replaces earned productivity, and the human cost was staggering. The mines at Potosí killed tens of thousands of indigenous workers. They died in the tunnels, buried under rockfalls. They died from silicosis, their lungs destroyed by rock dust after months of breathing in the fine particles. They died from mercury poisoning, because the silver extraction process required workers to trample mercury amalgam with their bare feet. Mercury destroys the nervous system. It causes tremors, loss of coordination, insanity, death. The symptoms would appear slowly. A miner's hands would begin to shake. Then his speech would slur. Then the hallucinations would start. By the time the symptoms were obvious, the damage was irreversible. Parents would maim their own children, break their legs, cut off fingers, to prevent them from being drafted into the mines under the Mita labor system. Think about that level of desperation. You would rather cripple your child than send them into that mountain. The locals called Potosí the mountain that eats men. If you squeezed the silver coins in circulation, people said blood would drip out. This wealth financed cathedrals and palaces. It paid for wars and coronations. It bought luxuries from around the world. But it was built on corpses. It was extracted through a mandatory labor draft called the mita, which forced indigenous men to work week-long shifts in darkness, hauling ore up rickety ladders while gasping for air in the thin mountain atmosphere at 13,000 feet above sea level. Many never came back up. The city of Potosí itself became one of the largest in the world by the early 1600s, bigger than London or Paris. But it was a city of nightmares, a city where fortunes were made in a month and lost in a night, where violence was casual and life was cheap, where the only certainty was that the silver must flow, no matter the cost. Back in Spain, Philip II died in 1598 after a prolonged illness, probably cancer. He died in his palace at El Escorial, surrounded by priests and advisors, having spent his entire reign fighting fires with borrowed money. He had worked obsessively. He reviewed every document personally, made decisions on the smallest administrative details. He was called Philip the Prudent for his careful, methodical approach to governance. And yet, despite all his prudence, despite all his effort, despite controlling more wealth than any monarch in human history, he died leaving his son an empire drowning in debt. His son, Philip III, inherited an empire that looked magnificent on maps, but was rotten at its core. The wars continued, the defaults continued, the decline continued. By the mid-1600s, Spain had lost the Netherlands permanently. It had lost its dominance of European politics. It had lost its competitive edge in every industry that mattered. The Spanish Armada was gone. The treasure fleets were declining, and the rest of Europe had moved on. So what does this tell us? What is the lesson that echoes across 4 centuries to reach us today? It is this: wealth and money are not the same thing. Wealth is productive capacity. Wealth is knowledge, skills, infrastructure, institutions, social trust. Wealth is the ability to make things people want and need. Money is just the tool we use to allocate that wealth. When you confuse the tool for the thing itself, you destroy both. Spain thought it had won the ultimate lottery. It had found the cheat code to prosperity: infinite money. But money without production is just inflation. It's just numbers going up while real living standards collapse. We are making the same mistake today. We print currency and call it wealth creation. We inflate asset prices and call it economic growth. We measure success by the size of stock portfolios and real estate values, not by our ability to make useful products or develop human potential. We have created entire economies built on financial engineering rather than productive investment. We believe that if we can just manipulate the money supply cleverly enough, if we can just get the interest rates right, if we can just inflate our way to prosperity, we can avoid the hard work of actually building things. We cannot. Spain tried. Spain had every advantage: more silver than anyone in history, a global empire, military dominance, direct control of the money supply. And Spain failed catastrophically. Look around at lottery winners. 70% of them are broke within 5 years. Look at people who inherit sudden wealth. Most squander it within a generation. Look at countries that discover oil: Nigeria, Venezuela, Russia. The pattern repeats with terrifying consistency. The money arrives. It feels like salvation. It creates a temporary boom. Prices rise. The productive economy withers. The easy money becomes a crutch, then a dependency, then a curse. By the time people realize what has happened, the damage is irreversible. The skills are gone. The habits are gone. The culture of productivity is gone. All that remains is debt, inflation, and the haunting memory of what could have been if they had built something real instead of spending something unearned. Philip II's empire stretched from Peru to the Philippines. He commanded armies, navies, and governors across 4 continents. He controlled more gold and silver than any human being before or since. He could buy anything. He could fund any war. He could build any monument. And yet, he died in debt, in pain, having watched his armada destroyed and his empire beginning its long, irreversible slide into irrelevance. Because he never understood the difference between money and wealth. He thought the silver was the point. He thought the treasure was the prize. He was wrong. The prize was the ability to create value. The prize was industrial capacity, human capital, institutional quality. The prize was building an economy that could generate prosperity without enslaving continents and without drowning in debt. He never built that. He just spent the silver. And when the silver ran out, there was nothing left. So the next time you dream about winning the lottery, remember Spain. Remember that the mountain of silver became a mountain that ate men. Remember that the richest empire on earth went bankrupt 4 times in 40 years. Remember that all the gold in the Americas could not save them from their own addiction to unearned wealth. Remember that wealth is not money. Wealth is what you build. Wealth is what you create. Wealth is the hard, unglamorous work of making your society more productive, more educated, more capable. There are no shortcuts. There never were. Spain tried to find one. They found a mountain of silver instead, and it destroyed them.